Hello everybody, welcome to History Forge. My name is Taylor Hamblin. I'm going to be working on inferring today, so we're going to do an inferring skill. And we're going to be focusing on a Texas Revolution primary source, or a couple primary sources actually, and looking at kind of how the Texas Revolution may have gotten started and why it became independent, or why the state of Texas became independent. So we're going to be looking at those two things today. On the screen, you should be able to see I have a few things written down, so if you're my students, go ahead and copy this stuff down. If you're a teacher watching this or you use this for your students, feel free to have them do the same thing if you like. But if you need to pause me, go ahead and do so now. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and move on. We're going to be talking about inferring the Texas Revolution today. We got skill number 5.4, inferred something about a person, place, or thing based on how the author described it. So basically, we need to think about reading between the lines. If we look at a primary source, whether it be a painting, a sketch, a quote from a diary or book or whatever, it doesn't matter. We need to look at it and ask ourselves, what can this thing tell us? What can this source tell us about, several different, different people, different events, specific people or events, or even just, general things. So in this case, what we're going to look at today is this question right here. How respectful were Americans of Mexico's laws? So we're going to be really focusing on that aspect. I got two sources we're going to look at. Letter from E.W. Ripley, and the other letter is from Rafael Manchola. And it'll be two different sources, one being Ripley is from an American perspective, Manchola is from a Spanish or Mexican perspective. So we're going to look at these two sources today. This is the site we're using. It's from CK12. We've got Texas Independence. So I'm going to read this little background information and we'll get into the sources. And remember, we're trying to figure out, what can these sources tell us about how respectful Americans were of Mexico's laws. Remember, a lot of times with inferring, the answer is not going to be just in the paragraph. This is not something you can just do like a fill-in-the-blank answer. You're going to have to do some thinking. You're going to have to ask yourself, okay, what do these actual lines of evidence mean? What is the personality? Like, what's the bias of the author? What are the feelings of it? Are there any key words I could be using? So actually, I'll type those things into... I had notes written somewhere. I can't find them. So words, perspectives, bias, feelings... kind of think about emotions. These are all things you should write down because these are all things that are good to look for, and I'll be doing that as I go through, okay? So think about this stuff as we try to answer this question. I'm going to use background information first. I'm going to read a little bit about what happened to Mexico and Texas and how Texas became a state, and then I'll go ahead and read the sources. So, Mexico declared its independence from Spain in 1821 and adopted a constitution in 1824. Through the 1820s and 1830s, Americans moved into the Mexican territory promising to uphold the Mexican Constitution. In 1833, General Santa Anna took control of the Mexican government and imposed a new constitution. So I'm going to pause right there. Already we're getting some good background information. Like, it's talking about how Americans promised to uphold the Constitution. Now remember, this is a primary. This part right now, it's not a primary source, so we can't use it for our answer. This is just, facts that happened in the past. So in 1833, General Santa Anna took control of the Mexican government and imposed a new constitution. A war followed with General Santa Anna's supporters fighting against the supporters of the old constitution and the Texan immigrants from the United States. In 1836, the American Texans went a step farther and declared independence from Mexico. The Texans won the war and became an independent nation, which was soon admitted into the USA as the 28th state. Read the documents below, and we'll skip that part. So we learned a little bit of the Mexican government declared independence. They kind of had a civil war for a while, and then they kind of brought in America. The Americans that were living in Mexico were called Texans. That's where we get the name Texas from. So the Texans did not side with any side in Mexico. They sided with the Americans. They wanted to have their own state and their own country. So that's not quite what Mexico had plans for. They wanted to keep that land, but they lost it because of their own civil war. So, reading through this, we're going to look at the two different letters. And again, we're thinking, how respectful were Americans of Mexico's laws? That's what we're focusing on, okay? So, doing a little inferring. Let's see. We have our first source here. It says letter, E.W. Ripley. So we know who the author is. We know it was a letter. The letter below is written by an American to the Mexican government in 1823, asking for permission to settle in Mexico. So we have a little more information we can possibly use. Dear Sir, a number of men of good character wish to move onto Mexican territory, south of the Colorado. Their object is to form a farming colony. This piece of land is now inhabited by Indians, and such colony would check their attacks. So right here he's basically saying that the colony would help prevent Native Americans from attacking any of the other colonists. So remember, this is a time period where European powers and Americans and Mexicans are taking over Native American land, and because of that, Native Americans are fighting back. So that's what he's kind of mentioning here. All right, so continuing with the source. These men promise to learn your language and follow your laws. So it's another really big thing right here. I'll underline that. Okay. They will defend your territory. Mostly there's a lot of wills, too. They're saying that we will do this. This has obviously not happened yet. Like, the people aren't there yet. He's requesting for them to come. These Americans would move immediately with their families if they can obtain a grant to settle the land. I think they would be great service to yourself individually and to the nation of Mexico. I have the honor to be your most obedient servant, E.W. Ripley, New Orleans, August 1823. So, some of my first notices that I'm going to, kind of go over. Some things that I'm looking into. Ripley seems to be very respectful of the Mexican government, which can be seen in his letter in which he states, and then, we would pull some kind of quote from it. I can think of like several of these would probably be good. Like, these men promise to learn your language and follow your laws. So we could say, these men promise to learn your language and follow your laws. So it's an example of something that, is good. And we could say this statement proves that Ripley at least tries to convince the Mexican government of Americans' good behavior. So, and here's another thing I said, or I mentioned. Ripley has a lot of future tense in his letter. So, I can assume that the settlers have not arrived yet. Therefore, there is no hard evidence that they will be well behaved. So think about it, when we look at primary sources, I tell my students all the time, think about the perspective, think about the bias. Like, how does Ripley know that these people are going to actually be well behaved? He's got a lot of future tense in here. Like, he can promise all he wants, but there's really no, thing holding them back. So my question of this automatically is, especially with answering the question, how respectful were Americans of Mexico's laws? I could say something like, if this is like the two bullet points right now were my answer, and it's or my evidence. I'm sorry. So if the bullet points were my evidence, then I would say, this Americans appear to be respectful according to E.W. Ripley, but Ripley provides no real proof that they will be. So, that's a fair thing to make. So maybe Americans will be, but maybe they won't. All we can really get from this is Americans were promised to be respectful, but we're not 100% sure. Like, Ripley has no evidence that he gives. So that would be my answer. Again, I would use these two things as my quotes, so I'll highlight. So the highlights would be my evidence. That would be the stuff. And then down here would be my explanation of my evidence. And going down to the letter Rafael Mancholo now. Looking at the name, Rafael Mancholo does not seem American. It might see, Rafael I think is French. Mancholo is definitely Spanish. So we're going to go ahead and look at this man named letter Rafael Mancholo. He's got a very short paragraph right here. Let's see. So this is who wrote it. He wrote a letter as well. So this letter below was written by Rafael Antonio Mancholo, a Tejano, Mexico, and he was a Mexican living in Texas. He wrote this letter about the Anglo-Americans in 1826 to a military commander. So in 1826, he wrote this about, these people moving here. So in 1823, they were being requested to move, and they probably moved within that year. And then Mancholo asked or wrote this letter saying, something about Americans. Sounds like he said he wrote this letter about Anglo-Americans. Okay. To a military commander, too, by the way. That's interesting. We should note that he's writing to a military commander, so there's probably some pretty big importance with this letter. All right, here we go. So it says, we cannot trust the Anglo-American colonists because they are continually demonstrating that they refuse to follow our laws. All right, that's pretty blunt. So, he's talking about laws right here. Unless it is convenient for them. We will have many problems if we do not stop their disrespectful behavior by stationing soldiers on a Mexican judge in each settlement. They have been using their own colonists as judges and practicing their own laws, forgetting they swore to obey the laws in Mexico. So, he is using a lot of present tense, so I'm assuming he's got a lot of experience with this. So we can say Manchola as a negative view towards Americans and believes Americans have not been obeying laws. He gives evidence stating that Americans use their own judges and follow their own laws. So kind of going deeper into this, we can see that Manchola is very upset because they're not being listened to. Compared to this letter 3 years ago, Ripley made it sound like they're going to obey the laws, but Manchola's like, no, they're not. I see these things. The fact that Manchola is writing to a military commander probably means that the situation is bad, and Manchola feels like he needs to take drastic action, I would say. So, we're interpreting right now. This is again, my bullet points here can be evidence, trying to figure out the question, how respectful are Americans to Mexico's laws. Coming down here in italicized, I can write, I can interpret Manchola's anger as the Americans that he has dealt with have not shown him respect or the law or respect for the laws of Mexico. So I think all of these things would be pretty accurate to say. So again, this is a big issue with interpreting. We have to sometimes get past some of the first primary sources. The first primary source makes it sound like, oh yeah, this is great. They definitely are being respectful. This letter is going to tell us this letter is proof. But if we look at Manchola's letter, we say no, they haven't been. So here's the deal: which one's being truthful? Which one's being more honest? We have to ask ourselves that too. What can we infer about these letters? We have to go deeper into the sources. So, for example, where it's this first one, it's in the future. There's really no proof that the Americans would be good, so we have to kind of ignore that. Whereas here, his letter, Rafael Manchola, he's got real firsthand experience. He lives in Mexico. This is 3 years later after having a lot of experience with Americans. Could he possibly be lying? Yeah, sure, he could be, but most likely he's not, especially since he's going to a military commander. I would trust Manchola's letter over Ripley's letter just because of that simple fact. So, we have all these different things here that we need to consider and look at, so make sure you are paying attention to those. I think that's pretty much it. Let's just go ahead and review real fast. It says, how respectful are Americans of Mexico's laws? Pretty simple, it looks like. Make sure you're paying attention to the words, perspectives, bias, and feelings of that. Make sure you've written all this stuff down, too, for notes. So that's pretty much it. Make sure you write all these things down, and if you have any questions, let me know. So for my students, you can go ahead and try this. All right, so hopefully if you're a teacher or another student that watches these, hopefully you got something out of that. I like using text. I like using CK12. They have a lot of good sources. They always give you good background information. There's more sources down here, too. They always have questions as well. I use the questions sometimes I don't. But there's a lot more stuff that the students could use. In fact, looks like there's at least 3 more sources. Yeah, there's 3 more sources they could use. So for them especially, it's really awesome. As far as the skill goes, inferring is hard. Inferring is difficult just because you have to somehow figure out how to read behind the lines. Like as an historian, as a teacher, it's easier for me just because I have so much background knowledge that I know what I'm looking for. And so for students, I have to figure out, well, what should they get? Like this question, I came up with this question because I know it. I know what I'm looking for. I know I want kids to think about the relationship between Mexico and Americans. I could have also talked about the migration, the Western migration. I could talk about immigration, especially seeing how one of the letters talks about how Americans will help fight off Native Americans. That's a big theme in Western migration. Immigration, too, is pretty big. You know, you can see here Americans are immigrating to Mexico and not following the rules. And so really it shows the opposite. Like, you know, a lot of Americans complain that immigrants come in and they have to spend so many years getting used to us. Why do we even bother with it? Well, here's an example of Americans doing the same thing. And in the end, it just kind of shows that immigration is always going to be this way. And immigration's got so many positive effects that it's worth trying to get people to get on board. But anyway, so a lot of different things you could go with if you want to. If you're interested in these videos, feel free to check out more. I got a lot of others on YouTube. I try to post 1 or 2 a week. We're also got a Facebook site we try to post stuff on, so check that out. We have social media all over the place. I'll put everything in the video description, so if you're curious about CK12 or you want more of these sites or sources, feel free to put them down. But that is it for me. I hope you guys have a great day. Take care. Bye.